of your control panel. Second, please submit all your questions through the Q&A box in the control panel. We'll be monitoring questions during the presentation, and I've saved time at the end to answer these questions. Finally, we couldn't host this event without the support of our sponsors, who are listed on the slide here. Thank you guys for your attention, and we'll get started.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Jason Jordan. I'm the Director of Policy and Public Affairs for the American Planning Association. Delighted to once again be able to be part of APA Florida's Public Policy Workshop. I've had the honor of being part of this event for several years. It's always one of the highlights of the calendar and a real model for APA chapters across the country, so happy to be with you. I'm going to join a couple of colleagues to talk about what's been happening in Washington over the first year of the Biden administration and what the impacts are for planners, local communities, and Florida in particular. I'm delighted to be joined today by Brad Thoburn. He's the Assistant Secretary for Strategic Development at Florida Department of Transportation. In that role, he's responsible for planning operations. He's going to play a really key role in the implementation of the new federal infrastructure law, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. He has a broad range of public and private sector experience, having been regional head of planning for Michael Baker International, and in a couple of different roles in Jacksonville. So really delighted to have him be part of the panel. And then our next speaker is Danielle Aragoni. Danielle is a longtime friend and collaborator, both of me personally and also of the American Planning Association. She's now the Director of Livable Communities for AARP's Government Affairs team. She has a really broad portfolio in that role, touching on a lot of critical planning concerns from housing and transportation to broadband, hazards and resilience. So a lot of areas of overlap in topics that are critical to planning. She's also been in leadership roles at both HUD and EPA focused on livable communities. So delighted to have Brad and Danielle be part of the panel. I wanted to start by saying a word or two about APA's federal policy priorities for 2022. We've really worked hard to kind of narrow our focus to heighten the potential for having real impact as so many critical things are happening at the federal level. The three areas of focus for the coming year are zoning reform, which has an affordable housing context in the way that we approach zoning reform, climate change, which obviously is a major issue for the entire globe, but for Florida in particular, and then the implementation of infrastructure and recovery legislation. And Brad, if you could go to the next slide, you'll see how these three topics really connect quite directly to where we have been in terms of federal policy over the last year. The first two tracks here are major landmark pieces of legislation that were enacted over the past year, signed into law. The first being the American Rescue Plan Act. This was the major COVID response and recovery legislation in the early months of the Biden administration. It really built on the CARES Act that had been passed the year previously. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between those two pieces of legislation and the impact for planning in just a second. Then a little bit later on in 2021, we saw the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the so-called Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law now at this point, that really combined both a full 5-year surface transportation reauthorization. So those of you who work in transportation know that we're on this cycle of regular reauthorizations for the existing surface transportation programs. So we have that embedded in this law alongside significant supplemental appropriations for a whole range of different kinds of infrastructure. On top of transportation, there's provisions in there for broadband and for water infrastructure, for other kinds of infrastructure. So these two big pieces of legislation were enacted and are really driving a lot of what we're seeing. So this connects to why implementation is such a critical component of our legislative and policy agenda for the year. The third major item is in a slightly different color because it hasn't made it across the finish line legislatively yet, and that's the Build Back Better Act. This is the piece of legislation that was designed to carry significant components of the administration's economic and social agenda. It covers a wide range of topics, many well beyond sort of the scope of traditional planning, but it does incorporate some provisions. In fact, it picked up a piece of legislation called the Housing Supply and Affordability Act, which was legislation aimed at creating a new program inside HUD that would support communities going through the process of modernizing their building codes and their zoning codes, housing action plans, things of that nature, and would provide direct assistance to that. So it was part of many different pieces of legislation covering a range of topics that were packaged together in Build Back Better. That has since stalled. I'll talk more in a second about exactly where we are in that process, but it hasn't made it across the finish line yet and is still pending. So it means that the zoning reform priority for us is still very much having a legislative context as opposed to surely an administrative implementation component. So when we look at the year ahead, the future of Build Back Better and whether that gets split apart into different pieces or whether some of the components get left on the cutting room floor and have to be picked up in different legislative vehicles sort of remains to be seen. But we've got these two pieces that we know are going to have a direct impact on communities today. So if we go to the next slide, I'll say a word about ARPA, or the rescue plan. I mentioned that the CARES Act had come before. Frankly, it was critically important that the CARES Act passed to get needed assistance into communities, but there were some problems with the specifics of that legislation that ARPA fixed in many instances, primarily around the issues of eligibility and flexibility. Too few communities could directly access CARES funds, and they were really tied very tightly to COVID response. So in ARPA, we have much broader eligibility and a tremendous amount of flexibility. So pretty much any item in a local government's budget that was negatively affected because of the pandemic, you can apply ARPA funds toward. There are some limitations, but it's quite flexible. It's a blend of both grants and formula funding, so it sort of depends on exactly what you're going after in terms of how you get it. But one of the other important components here is you got a much longer time horizon. So 5 full years to actually spend down ARPA funds, which, even though it's in the context of recovery, gives you a little bit longer platform to think about how these funds are actually going to be expended and the kinds of projects they could be expended on, which gives us an opportunity really to think very holistically about how ARPA funds blend or connect with the infrastructure dollars as a community thinks about its overall strategy for development over the course of several years. Which brings me, if you go to the next slide, to some of the kind of key elements of the infrastructure law. Brad's going to go into detail about exactly what you can expect. I just wanted to hit some broad themes here so you can see how it connects to both the planning process and how ARPA is being deployed in communities. What you will find when Brad goes through an analysis of the bill is that there's some major shifts in here. A record number of new discretionary grant programs. So I think many of us have come to expect the majority of the dollars to be spent through formula. So now we're seeing a growth in discretionary grant programs. We're also seeing 2 brand new formula programs come into existence, one on resiliency, one on carbon reduction. These are going to put a great deal of pressure on the implementation process, setting the rules in place, setting the guidelines in place, what's eligible, what are the criteria that are going to be used in those discretionary grant programs. Really makes the implementation and the rulemaking process really more critical than ever when we think about the actual impact of the law on communities and planning. We see more planning dollars set aside in these programs. That was one of the core points that APA made in the debate over the legislation, is that it was important to directly support planning as we think about what long-term recovery actually looks like. And there are a lot of reforms to existing programs as well. So when we think about that implementation piece again, in addition to standing up these new programs, we're also going to be looking at how those reforms in existing programs like the Transportation Alternatives Program, for instance, are actually put into place. And then the last point I would make is that throughout the bill, you see this intentional linkage of housing and infrastructure, land use and infrastructure, which is a clear point of emphasis for this administration in particular. And I think one that raises some interesting opportunities for MPOs and local governments to work together on that exact coordination of the land use, the housing, and the transportation piece. If you could go to the next slide, we've seen some new recommendations begin to flow out of the administration as they begin that process of implementation. A new guidebook was released just over a week ago to begin helping local governments begin to sort through the opportunities that are there. Mitch Landrieu, the former mayor of New Orleans, has been named sort of the senior advisor and the overseer really of the implementation of the infrastructure law. He issued a directive of sorts, a statement aimed at local governments, and sort of summarize his guidance, his initial guidance, which is available at the build.gov website that they have, into 4 categories. And it's interesting that really, in a way, they all touch on areas of significance to planning and planners. The first area of advice is to prioritize, to begin really sorting through projects where you want to begin to apply infrastructure dollars, or you want to look at ARPA opportunities so that you know what you're going for. Secondly, in several instances, there's very direct suggestions about mapping to understand where you've got gaps, to understand how communities may or may not be benefiting from current investments, so that can really guide particularly things like the broadband program, but other investments as well. There's a suggestion to update plans, which of course we're all in the process of doing, but really thinking through about what is the plan, and on the capital side, how are we going to begin, accessing these different pots of funding. And then lastly, the importance of partnership, both with state agencies and MPOs. I think the clear indication is that kind of partnership is going to be critical to scoring well in terms of the criteria and eligibility for the discretionary programs, but also be beneficial for ensuring that the dollars flow into your critical projects by having that great partnership at the regional and at the state level. So if we go to the next slide, just to sort of glean a few very early lessons for the implications on communities from what we're seeing in the implementation of the infrastructure law. If you look to the RAISE guidance, RAISE is the new name for the old Tiger Grant program that's been around since 2008, 2009, I guess 2009 in the aftermath of the Great Recession, as one of the major transportation infrastructure discretionary competitive grant programs. New guidance was just issued, and you can see in that guidance the impact of the law, the infrastructure law. There's set aside funding for planning, there's increased funding for planning, and there are increased minimum amounts of grants for planning. So planning really is getting additional support in the new program. But if you look at the criteria for being competitive to access it, you can see the emphasis of the priorities of this administration. So there's a clear focus on social equity and ensuring that investments flow to disadvantaged communities. There's a real focus on ensuring that transportation investments are tackling climate change and advancing resilience. And there's also language really for the first time in a very explicit way that talks about the coordination with land use and zoning reform and housing investments, and how capital transportation projects funded through RAISE would benefit other areas because of the coordination there. So I think there's a real shift in emphasis, and we're going to see that carried through other programs beyond RAISE. We've seen it in some of the other programs that have recently been announced, but I think this is kind of a window into where US DOT may be going in many respects. Safety is another kind of key area of concern that they've identified very early on. So if you go to the next slide, I mentioned Build Back Better, and that's really the big question about what's next. I think there's a lot of implications for climate change in there, for housing, certainly for a range of social policy, but we've been really focused on the zoning reform and the climate change aspects of the bill. And honestly, from that perspective, the prognosis is not great. I think for a lot of reasons, some political, some economic, Build Back Better is going to be slimmed down if it moves at all. And that slimming process probably means that a few core components will remain, and many of the other pieces, including housing, will likely not move as part of the Build Back Better package. I hope I'm wrong about that, but that's kind of where we seem to be set up at the moment. Question mark around which of the climate provisions may ultimately make it into that package or not. There does seem to be some momentum for clean energy and some climate provisions to move forward as part of Build Back Better. But honestly, with an election coming up, it's going to be challenging to move any Build Back Better piece, although there is some conversation still underway about where is there consensus that could bring all 50 Senate Democrats on board to ensure its passage. Which means, if you go to the last slide here, for the zoning reform piece, which is known as Unlocking Possibilities, that's a name given to it by the administration, we're going to be looking for other opportunities to move that forward. Build Back Better created this program, $1.75 billion for direct assistance for planning and zoning reform related to affordable housing. We're going to go back and look at opportunities to pick up the Housing Supply and Affordability Act, and also clearly there's some opportunities inside the administration to advance it through other mechanisms. So we're going to continue to push on Build Back Better to include Unlocking Possibilities. If indeed that fully stalls, then we're going to shift and see what other opportunities are available. And Brad, if you could just go to my last slide, and then I'll turn it over to you. I just wanted to make a quick plug for our Planners Advocacy Network. One more slide forward. Yes, thank you. This is an opportunity for any APA member to get more directly involved in both tracking and monitoring what's happening in Washington, working with my team on being an active, vocal advocate on behalf of a pro-planning agenda and opportunities to move some of these things forward, both in terms of the implementation of these big pieces that have already been enacted, and then adding new tools to the toolbox legislatively. So that's sort of the broad context. I'm going to turn it over now to Brad to talk in more depth and detail about what's happening with the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Brad, take it away.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that sort of teeing me up here. And I've got this is a little bit of experiment on our end. We created one PowerPoint for all discussions related to the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we kind of try to allow us to tailor it to the audience. So so I'm going to hop around here a little bit and try to give you a good overview and flavor that's really a little bit more focused on the planning side and policy. So as Jason mentioned, the reauthorization of the Federal Surface Transportation Act, or the FAST Act, is actually a major piece of the bipartisan infrastructure law. I know a lot of times people saw the big number of 1.2 trillion, and I think it's important to put in the context that it is a reauthorization. So at some level, this is money that was sort of extension of existing programs, and so our work program anticipates an extension or reauthorization. So this really helps support our work program, gives us some stability. And one of the things we always struggle with was when we get these short extensions of reauthorizations and continuing resolutions on the appropriation side, always creates challenges. So one of the positive things here is that it does create that certainty and extension of, and it really, in many ways, it does build on the existing framework. But as Jason mentioned, there are significant increases both in the amount of funding formula funding, as well as some additional programs. And one of the major pieces is the addition of a competitive funding or discretionary grants. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. I wanted to cover really the policy side as you know, there are kind of, and Jason touched on a couple of these already, but there are really some key components here that sort of are weaved throughout the bill. Obviously, a focus on safety is one. You know, the bill actually contains a number of new programs that are consistent with the Florida Transportation Plan and Florida's Strategic Highway Safety Plan, as well as our Vital Few programs. It makes safety more important across a range of programs and acknowledges the safe system approach and uses safety as a factor throughout several programs. And you'll see in grant opportunities, there are a lot of places where you're going to see safety emphasized. And It also embraces Vision Zero, which aligns with the FDOT's target. And then I think it's important to know that both the department and our MPOs are already doing a lot of this work, so the bill really reinforces that. As it relates to highway safety improvement plan, it does add eligibility for specific safety projects. That includes non-infrastructure safety projects related to education, research, enforcement, emergency services, and safe routes to school. It does modify the definition of highway safety improvement projects by adding and clarifying some project types that includes rail, highway, grade crossing, separations, traffic control devices for bike and pedestrians, and improvements that separate motor vehicles from pedestrians and bicycles. It's worth noting that again, that we'll get into the discretionary, but there are a number of new programs related. Equity is something that you obviously we've been hearing a lot about, not only in bill but through some of the policy priorities of the administration. They're really, I will say, within our existing FTP, the equity programs are aligned to provide more choices that improve access and accessibility and equity. The bill actually builds on, includes, advancing the Justice 40 initiative and the executive order that was passed or that was enacted by the administration. And it also dedicates some key formula and grant programs for underserved communities and disadvantaged areas. Some of the examples are the TAP program, the Transportation Alternatives, provides priority to projects located in high need areas, such as low income or transit dependent or rural areas. It allows a reduced local share for MPO planning funds for planning activities, assisting parts of planning area with lower population density or lower average income levels. And then also of note is when designated boards for new MPOs, the MPOs need to contemplate equitable and proportional representation in the population of metropolitan area. And Jason also mentioned the need to coordinate with housing, which is you can see throughout the bill. Resilience is another key area that I know obviously is highly important to Florida and our communities throughout the state. That actually was a planning factor in the last authorization. So this really builds on that. It helps build on the work that we're seeing throughout the state. There will be a stronger emphasis on coordination with agency partners responsible for natural disaster risk reduction. There's a creation of a new PROTECT program, which is the Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Effective Transportation program. I know we'll all remember that. But there also is there's both a competitive and a formula piece of that. So that is important to note. So we'll get a formula share through the state, and there'll be opportunities to compete for funding. There are also, you'll see, and you'll see this throughout the program, the policy priorities. You see an expansion of eligibility in some of the major programs like the STVG and the ability to use NHS funds for resilience features. One of the things I would note on resilience, it is creating a separate program, but it's sort of like safety. We have to build a culture where we're integrating safety and resilience into all of our projects, which we do. And so I think that's important that we don't lose focus on that. The last area is modernization and emerging mobility. These are new mobility options, largely resulting from advances in technology, can really help us throughout implementing all of the goals in our Florida Transportation Plan. And so there are a lot of opportunities within the bill to support the adoption of emerging technologies. And so the other piece that's really important is modernization. You see that a lot in the transit area specifically. And then EVs are an area where we'll talk about that a little bit in the grant programs, but the EV area is a great focus of the bill that you'll see. It's worth noting one of the other discretionary grant programs is the smart, just really around smart cities type initiatives that will be supported. There are some other key policy areas that are of note. Some of these, in December, FHWA and FTA released planning emphasis areas. These are planning activities they expect states, NPOs, transit agencies to incorporate into their work programs. In addition to the emphasis areas covered in the previous slide that I mentioned, these areas were addressed. And so this is new information. We expect FHWA, FTA will elaborate and build on those. But some key areas: public involvement, straw net coordination, federal land management, and planning and environmental linkages, as well as data management are key areas. So look for more in those areas. So I want to go back and talk a little bit about sort of the formula versus competitive funding areas. One of the things that is sort of a noteworthy shift in this bill is, or at least on the transportation piece. And I want to kind of step back also and note that when you think about the overall bill, the 1.2 million, I'm only covering a portion of it, because if you look, you can see, the investments throughout the bill include a whole host of different areas that are outside of the transportation space. Some may be able to connect, but I'm just really focused on the transportation piece. And of note is there is a significant increase in the overall formula funding to the state of Florida, so about a 35% increase. We've seen an increase in each one of the subsequent bills. That's not surprising. This is a significant increase, and I think what's of note is that you can see the programs that are funded, and they all kind of have similar increases. Some are a little bit smaller than others. But I would note that in some of the areas where there's smaller increases in formula, they're kind of associated sometimes with increases in new discretionary programs. So I noted the Protect program, but also carbon reduction program as well. Within the new formula programs, and these are a little bit smaller than the ones identified in that previous slide, we have the new bridge formula program and the electric vehicle formula program. One of the things I would note, the bridge formula program is quite significant in the state nationally, but for Florida, it's pretty small, because I think you probably heard the Secretary or others talk about, we just sort of get penalized for taking good care of our bridges, and honestly, we get about 20% on the dollar for our equitable share of the bridge program, because we've taken better care of our bridges. So that's a little frustrating. It's not a great incentive in our mind, but it's reality. EV program just came out with their recommendation, with their apportionments and some guidance. So I know we'll all be poring over that. I think one of the things to note is they did set aside $300 million for the joint office. So we put $198 million, but this year I think we're going to get $29 million. So it's a little less than we anticipated, but I hope that's not a recurring $300 million set aside. As we look at competitive programs, and again, this is a big change. In the past authorizations, we've seen a trend to streamlining programs and expanding eligibility and building on the core programs that are formula. This kind of reversed that. We added some new programs. We still expanded eligibility within existing programs like the STBG, but definitely kind of saw a movement towards decision making at the federal level with the increase in competitive funding programs. So as kind of some of the examples we see here is you've got the bridge program is complementary to the formula program. Infra and RAISE and this one, the National Infrastructure Project Assistance. Some will refer to that as the mega program. Chrissy, all these got, some of them are existing, but they all got, even the existing programs got significant increases in funding. As we look at some of the investments that relate to transit, and as well as some of these, I think you're going to find are where the state gets formula funds. I think our expectation is that the locals will probably fare pretty well in the competitive. I think the idea is that, you know, especially you look at the EV program, the state's getting formula funds, so there's competitive program. The state's probably not going to be the preferred applicant in those. And so our role is going to be, how do we help our local partners compete for funding? Moving in, I'm not going to go over all of the modal areas, but of note, I think from a planning perspective, a significant increase was seen in transit funding, especially related to state of good repair and access, additional rural funds as well. Again, and that's kind of is on top of, I think, some really major investments that you saw in some of the CARES and COVID recovery rescue plans. As it relates to rail, this is another area where intercity rail specifically sees a major investment, $66 billion. One of the things of note is when we show these fundings, the funding levels, they're advanced appropriation, so they don't need appropriation, and some of them have authorizations beyond that that allow them to get additional funding. And so passenger rail is one of those. I think they can go up to $90-some billion in full authorization. So a lot of this will go to the Northeast Corridor, but there's also a significant amount that's set aside for state partnership program, so the federal state partnership grants are competitive, but they're competitive kind of through FRA, that you'll see Amtrak going after those in partnership with the states and potentially some private partners like Brightline. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. A lot of this will greatly enhance the Northeast Corridor. As we look to implementation, we're going to be following guidance that's coming out on it. Jason referenced the Build website, which is a great resource you should take a look at. And then the other thing is that we all should be looking at identifying project opportunities where we can compete or we can partner and build those great competitive projects. And the department is working to engage our local partners, our districts, et cetera, to help prepare for that. With a lot of the discretionary grants, there's going to be a burden in terms of not only developing the grant, so there's going to be a burden on local governments, the department, as well as FHWA and staffing up, which I think will be kind of a challenge because of the current labor market. But the other thing to contemplate is that, we look at a lot of our communities that really want to compete for these funds, may not always have the technical resources or the know-how. And so that's where we can be an important partner. Again, just wanted to share with you, there are some great resources out there, and both the Florida DOT as well as US DOT. So with that, I always like to end with a safety message from the department, but we are always focused on how we can improve safety throughout our state. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Danielle for her portion of the presentation. Danielle.
Great. Thank you, Brad. Appreciate that. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here today. Thank you, Jason, for those kind words at the top. I'm going to dash through this pretty quickly so we have time for questions. So next slide, please. Briefly, I want to kind of paint a picture of how this infrastructure package that you've heard Jason and Brad describe can benefit older adults. And I say that, or I offer that viewpoint from the perspective of my role, which is Director of Livable Communities here at AARP, wherein we have a state office there in Florida, which has been had a very strong and productive partnership with APA for many years now. And it's always driven by this notion that that we're on the cusp of this demographic change, and these infrastructure investments really need to and should be inclusive of that viewpoint. By 2034, we'll be a country more of people over 65 than under 18. I believe in Florida that day might have already occurred. We're very, very close. Next slide, please. And what that means is that we really need to be thinking about all of these things we've been talking about: transportation, housing, public spaces, broadband, with the needs of older adults in mind. So we know that transportation doesn't necessarily serve the needs of older adults, particularly when many people outlive their ability to drive. And for many people, particularly women over 75, a third of them don't drive at all. We know that public transit is in crisis, but it's a lifeline for many people who are older or who have disabilities. We also know that older adults are increasingly among pedestrian and bicycle fatalities. Everyone, I think, on this call knows about the National Roadway Strategy and the degree to which that has really flagged a crisis in our country, which very much impacts older adults. On the connection side, we also know that older adults are not benefiting from the, oh, if you could go back one, thank you. They're not benefiting from the same kind of digital access that many of us enjoy. We know that about 15% of adults over 50 don't have access to any internet at all, and that many say that cost is a problem, and that lack of connection, both digital and physical in community, that lack of connection really can have very serious health side effects. Next slide, please. All of which is to say that we need to be thinking about what it is that older adults need and seek in their communities, and find ways to use this generational opportunity to really create more age-friendly communities. We know that older adults want to be able to age in their community. They want to stay there. Well over 3/4 of older adults say that. And they really value street safety. They value opportunities to connect with others. They value safe trails and pathways to walk and run and bicycle and roll. And that they're open to a whole bunch of different housing solutions that we won't get into today. But these are the kind of essential components that really do comprise a community that is ready for that kind of demographic future. Next slide, please. And that's really the sort of backdrop that I want to paint. I'll go through these next slides very quickly because we've heard detailed descriptions from Jason and Brad. Next slide. A couple of things that we're really excited about, particularly on broadband, is the degree to which the broadband investments in the Infrastructure Act can bring down the cost of internet access. So there's the Affordable Connectivity Program is out now that reduces the cost of internet access on a monthly basis for qualified households. There's $40+ billion that will go into expanding infrastructure to unserved and underserved communities, which is huge, as well as other efforts that we're very excited about, including digital equity training investments. Next slide, please. On transportation, I won't go into this. We're super excited about the investments in transit and in roadway safety and in bringing greater focus to vulnerable road users and to the emphasis that will mean for complete streets. We're particularly excited about the accessibility investments that this means for some of our legacy transit stations and much more. This really is an important, critically important opportunity. Next slide, please. And while we didn't advocate around these issues, you've already heard of the importance of resilience investments from both Jason and Brad. We're equally excited about them. We know that safe and reliable utilities are, again, a lifeline, but that other investments to address weatherization and wildfire and much, much more is critically important. Next slide, please. So there, as well, ARPA still is out there as the sort of ongoing opportunity to invest in, again, these community-wide infrastructure components that make for a better community. Next slide, please. Skip ahead a couple. One more, please. So there are a number of resources that we at ARP want to offer to you for contemplation, for thinking about as you work in your communities to avail yourselves of these funds. One of which is the Age Friendly Network, which I hope you all are very well familiar with. It's a voluntary program wherein communities can commit to an age-friendly future. There are more than 50 communities that are part of the network there in Florida, over 600 communities countrywide. And in all of these places, plans have already been developed that speak to housing and transportation and public spaces and the values that older adults seek, the attributes that older adults seek in those investments. So please use those as you think of ways in which you can build yourselves towards that more age-friendly future. We'll skip ahead to the next slide, please. There's obviously our livability index tool, I hope, is a resource to you all. We have a map online where you can look up communities across Florida, across the country, what they're doing to inspire you to take age-friendly action. And I'll speak about a couple of publications on the next few slides. So please, next slide, please. But I do want to call your attention in particular to the Community Challenge Grant Program, which again, the theme of the day is free money's out there. So ARP2 is once again making available small catalytic demonstration grant investments. I promise you they're much more flexible than federal funding is, but they're also much, much smaller. But they're very timely, and I think these are great ways to make the case for innovative solutions in transportation, in infrastructure, in ways that really benefit older adults. So I would encourage you to find out more about that. We've invested in a whole wide range of things over the years. This will be our 6th year of the program. Last day to apply is March 22nd. learn more at aarp.org/community-challenge. Next slide, please. And there are a couple of resources that I want to make sure that I draw your attention to. We have resources. These are free publications that are available upon request that are on placemaking, which again is a great way to demonstrate innovative solutions that make it easier for people to walk and bike and to have safe spaces in which to connect with one another. We have a parks guide that really unpacks what it means to create an age-friendly public space and park in ways that benefit all users. Next slide, please. We have a great resource that is relatively new on zoning that we did in partnership with Congress for New Urbanism that kind of unpacks some of the most low-hanging fruit, if you will, the incremental changes that can be made in your zoning code so that we're creating more age-friendly, more walkable communities. Next slide, please. And finally, I'll draw your attention to a couple other resources. Just yesterday, we released our brand new updated walk audit toolkit, which I think is a critically important and valuable tool to engage community members in assessing the pedestrian safety and comfort of communities and really teeing up very focused recommendations and requests to local leaders that can be funded through a lot of the programs we've described today. And in addition, we also offer resources on smart cycling so that when we're getting people back out there on the bicycles, we know that they can be as safe as possible. Next slide, please. I think that's, a couple final resources to share. We have a guide on how to use ARPA funds to help local leaders. There are a number of resources on our website, and I will point you to our partners, which is a group called OATS, Older Adults Technology Services, and they work very clearly and very specifically to help older adults better access the digital future that is increasingly available to us all. I think that's all my slides, and so I will stop there and hope that we have time for questions.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Brad. Really great presentations. I know we could have spent more time talking about lots and lots of the details and all these major new opportunities that are out there. I'm going to sort of throw out, we do have a couple of minutes here for questions. If you have questions, you can submit them in the questions box. But I'm going to sort of start and throw out a question to both Danielle and to Brad. And it's sort of broad. So for a long, long time, for decades really, if you're working in planning or you're working at the local level and you're thinking about projects and needs in your community, resource constraint has been the world that you have operated in for a long time. And I'm not going to pretend that that isn't still a reality in many places, but an equal reality is that the system is now rich with resources from ARPA, the new infrastructure law. Many states are in better fiscal shape than they've been in a long time. So I'm sort of curious from your perspective, like if you're a planner, if you're a local official, if you're thinking about those new investments and you're not as worried or focused on the resource constraint piece, what's your advice? Like if you're thinking about how do I take advantage of this, how do I do some of the things that the three of us talked a little bit about. What's your thought on that kind of new operating in this new environment for planners?
I can kick us off with a real quick observation. I think it's going to be critically important to turn to existing plans and to I don't mean existing plans that haven't been reevaluated recently. I mean pay homage, pay attention to plans that already reflect solid community engagement and community input, such as the age-friendly plans that I described. I mean, those can really be treasure troves, I think, of ideas and of coalitions that are going to be critically important to implementing this money, because this does not fall all on local municipalities' shoulders. This really is going to call on all of us, I think, to effectively deliver this, to deliver on the promise of this investment. So use those plans, use existing coalitions, and then continue to build them out with gaps as you identify them over time.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And I think the other thing is, we talk a lot about partnerships, and this is just going to place an emphasis on how we work with between jurisdictions. We're going to have to break down some of the geographic boundaries. I think especially when we talk about competing for funding, we're going to have to figure out. We're going to have to be creative. And we're gonna have to think about how do we put really strong regional, multimodal, fully integrated strategies together. And I think those that, you got to kind of catch people's attention, but I think the things that will, and you know where the policy priorities are, and those may shift over time. But I think what will stay consistent is that those kind of initiatives that involve a lot of different partners and show collaboration and a long-term vision will be better suited to compete for funding.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Brad. I see we're at the top of the hour. Would love to continue this conversation, but I want to thank Danielle. I want to thank Brad. Great information. Thank you to APA Florida for putting on this workshop and for allowing us to talk a little bit about what's happening on the federal side and how it affects your community. So thanks, everybody. If you have other questions that we didn't get to, I'm sure follow up with APA Florida and they'll be sure to pass it along, and we'll be happy to follow up. Thanks, everybody.